One small step for man.
Shining city upon a hill.
The skies over Baghdad have been illuminated. We're
in a limited military action in Libya.
In the early 20th century, the United States faced a lot of challenges and change. There was a lot of urbanization as people moved from the countryside to the cities, and industrialization was everywhere. But something else was going on too at this time. There were ideologies that wanted to destroy or replace the American system. And for many Americans, it appeared that the system was broken. And then, in September 1901, an anarchist assassinated President William McKinley. So to many Americans, it appeared that the country was falling apart. And similar to today, the rich got richer, while the poor got poorer. So progressivism came about to fix the system, not destroy it, by giving everyone, as one president put it, a square deal. Progressivism is a broad political movement made up of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And what progressives want is to reform the American system. And the man who came to define the era of progressivism was this man, Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt believed in what he called the square deal, a promise that every American, no matter what their race, color, or religion, would get a fair shot at the American dream. His domestic policy focused on fairness and equality for all Americans. It aimed to address the needs of the workers, businesses, and consumers by advocating regulations of corporations to prevent monopolies and ensure fair competition, protection of consumers through measures like food safety laws, conservation of natural resources to preserve the environment for future generations, and civil rights for all Americans. What Theodore Roosevelt believed is that all Americans should have equal opportunity when it came to social issues and economic issues. He promoted fairness rather than favoring one group over another. This defined TR's square deal. To do all this, Theodore Roosevelt first tackled the trusts. These were massive monopolies that controlled entire industries. Companies like John Rockefeller's Standard Oil and J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities. And they had more power than the government itself. In 1902, Roosevelt used the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed on July 2, 1890, to outlaw monopolies. This was the federal government's first law to prohibit monopolies in America. And TR used it to break the Northern Securities, a massive railroad monopoly. And he didn't stop there. Over 40 other trusts fell under his administration. The next thing Theodore Roosevelt tackled was consumer protection. After this book, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair exposed the horrifying conditions in the meatpacking industry. Roosevelt pushed for landmark reforms. The Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 set the foundation for the FDA. And if you've ever enjoyed a visit to the many national parks we have, such as Yellowstone, the Everglades, or Yosemite, you can thank Roosevelt. He protected over 230 million acres of public land, establishing the national parks, monuments, and wildlife refuges. For him, conservation wasn't just about nature. It was about the future, and that future generations would enjoy the many natural wonders that this country has to offer. Now, Roosevelt's progressivism wasn't always as inclusive as it could have been. But he did make some bold moves for his time. Moves that sparked national conversations about race and equality. One such move is when he invited Booker T. Washington, a prominent African American leader, to the White House for dinner. It was the first time an African American had been invited to the White House. while Roosevelt saw it as a gesture of respect and inclusion. This caused an uproar, especially in the segregated South. And critics from the South accused him of crossing the racial lines, and he faced intense backlash. The criticism was insane. It was so intense that Theodore Roosevelt never invited Booker T. Washington back to the White House. But his civil rights was ahead of its times. In his first year of his presidency, a crisis took place in America. Almost 150,000 coal miners from Pennsylvania went on strike. The miners wanted better pay and better work conditions. But instead of listening to the miners, the owners of the mines met the workers with violence. When you think about coal and how important it is in 1901, think about oil and how important it is to us today. This was America's biggest industry, and America couldn't afford the strike. The strike threatened to paralyze the nation's economy as it headed into winter. On top of all this, the owners of the mines were filthy rich, while the coal miners lived in poverty. Laws to protect Americans, especially children, did not exist at the time. Workers' conditions were terrible. But instead of siding with big business, as many presidents before him and after him will do, Roosevelt stepped in as mediator. He brought union leaders and mine owners to the negotiating table. He even threatened to nationalize the coal mine if the owners did not play ball. The result? A compromise that gave workers a 10% wage increase and reduced work hours, though it stopped short of union recognition. The event shows the extent that Roosevelt was willing to go in order to give Americans a square deal. This was a groundbreaking moment, a moment when an American president was willing to use federal power to mediate labor disputes. It also set the precedent for future presidents. When it came to foreign policy, you could sum it up in a single phrase. His favorite West African proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick. Now, this wasn't just a metaphor. It was his blueprint for U.S. power on a global stage. One of his boldest moves was the Panama Canal. By supporting Panamanian independence from Colombia, Roosevelt secured the rights to build a canal that revolutionized global trade. Not only did it connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, but it gave the United States a massive strategic advantage. But more important than the Panama Canal is the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. This declared that the United States had the right to intervene in Latin America to stabilize the region. It set the tone for decades of U.S. intervention in Latin America and the Caribbean. Roosevelt also became America's first president to win the Nobel Peace Prize when he brokered a peace between the Russians and the Japanese to stop that war in 1905. This single episode defined America's role in the 20th century and why it became known as the American century.